Yeah, let's go ahead and do it.
Great. So I'm recording.
Okay.
And as I said, this is for our Stanford class, Technology, Innovation, and Modern War. And we'd just like today to kind of talk about doctrine, since you are kind of the Army's doctrine guy. And maybe we start with kind of an introduction of who you are and what your role is, and what's the role of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's great being here with you in your class, even if it's just virtually. So my name is Colonel Rich Creed, and as Steve said, I am the director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And so my job is to be the executive arm for training at U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command for all things doctrine. We integrate essentially all the different specialized doctrine that the Army requires across its various branches and specialties, various organizations. So while we write some of it here, we primarily review the doctrine that's produced in these other doctrine producing entities. And there's about 30 of them in the Army that have responsibility for various pieces of doctrine. So we make sure it's integrated within the Army, first of all, and then with the Joint Force and Joint Doctrine, and then with our multinational allies and partners, because we have a NATO doctrine and publications that we share with the Five Eyes, the five English-speaking armies through ADCANS.
So that's a ton to unpack, even though it was a very short introduction. So why don't we start with the simplest one for our students? Not all of them are ex-military. Like, what is doctrine, and why does it matter? I thought the Army was just guns and, artillery and tanks, and what's the doctrine stuff?
Yeah, so I'll read you a couple things that are descriptive, okay? Because doctrine does lots of different things. So we'll kind of talk about a description first. And so what we say in our doctrine pub that describes what doctrine is, a couple different things. So doctrine is the body of professional knowledge that guides how soldiers perform tasks related to the Army's role. The employment of land power is in a distinctly American context. So the application of land power by the United States Army in all its various manifestations. Doctrine also establishes the language of our profession. And so we view the Army as a profession, and as a profession it has its own unique languages or language. And that language has lots of different dialects, right? Doctrine fits into the larger body of Army knowledge, okay? So each organization develops specific ways to do things. I have certain kinds of units, they have to operate a certain type of way, but they all have to be able to work together as a team. So specific doctrine that addresses one kind of formation, for example, in one type of context, has to be congruent with that larger body of knowledge. We don't want things conflicting with each other. Words need to mean the same thing in all the different contexts. So when we talk about the language of the profession, that's what we mean. We talk about this idea that large, complex organizations often require more than one body of knowledge to address the varieties of tasks they perform. So that gets to that last point I made. The Army is required for the nation to do all kinds of different things all over the world in a variety of contexts. We do what we're asked to do in the places we're sent. So doctrine needs to be able to provide not just a unifying language, but a shared situational awareness about what we're talking about when we're solving military problems. So that larger body of knowledge that doctrine fits into includes things like Army regulations that talk about how we administer ourselves. Doctrine, which addresses the conduct of operations and the tasks that we execute during those operations. Then we have training publications that basically prepare units for that. And then we have technical manuals that tell you how your equipment works. So many times people will lump all of those things together as doctrine. But the important thing with doctrine is it's not rules and regulations, okay? It addresses the conduct of operations. And that's how it relates to operational concepts. Okay, so I think
So
we'll talk about that later.
let's drill down to conduct of operations for a second. I mean, maybe describe how fires or sustainment, or would each one of them have their own Army doctrine for those areas, for example?
Right. So that's exactly right. So we kind of organize Army capabilities according to what we call warfighting functions. Okay. So intelligence, fires, movement and maneuver, protection, sustainment, and command and control. So we have doctrine that fits into each of those 6 categories, with command and control being the doctrine that integrates and synchronizes the application of those different capabilities in context. So we don't arbitrarily establish it, and it's not a static thing. It's a living, breathing body of knowledge, and it comes from some different sources. So in each of those areas, whether you're talking command and control or intelligence or fires, sustainment, we call things sustainment. You can think of it in terms of logistics. But it comes from decades and sometimes centuries of experience, right? So it evolves over time. And then there's best practices that may be unique to a particular era based on technology or recent experience, the nature of the threat, the environments that you're operating in. So that applicability over time tends to vary according to circumstances. And we may stress certain aspects of doctrine more during a particular era, think counterinsurgency over the last 20 years, as opposed to large-scale ground combat operations that were largely the focus of training and readiness, say, between the end of the Vietnam War and the end of the Cold War. Then we use doctrine in 2 different contexts, primarily. Right? One is study and reflection. Right? So being part of a profession, we demand for people to be at the level of professionalism they need to be. They need to study and reflect upon the profession, and doctrine is a large part of that. And then the other context is the actual conduct of operations themselves, planning, preparing, executing, and assessing those operations, and doctrine helps us with that. So it's got to be, in that sense, both theoretical and practical. So there's some military theory that supports doctrine and the way we do things, but it has to be able to be practically applied by forces on the ground. The bulk of the United States Army, for example, and all the services, probably, 70% of the service is people that are under 25 years old. The percentage of people that are gray-haired like me, they've been in 30 years, is very, very small. So when you write doctrine, you're not writing it for people with master's degrees. You're not even writing it for people with college degrees. You're writing it at a level that it should be able to be understood by reasonably intelligent people reading at a 12th grade level on one pass. Now, obviously, we don't always hit that mark because some things are very complicated and require higher order thinking. But at the very basic level, that's what we write to. So, it kind of reminds you of that apocryphal saying it's attributed to Albert Einstein, right? That says you never really understand something until you can explain it to your mom, right? So if there may be very complicated ideas, but from a doctrinal perspective, clarity is very important. Simplicity, succinctness, clarity. And so we try to keep things as simple as possible, even if the overall idea or the theory might be relatively complex.
And the overall idea for the Army and for the military, a doctrine was, I don't know, when I was in the military in the 80s or 90s, or at least after I got out, was something like air-land battle. Was that a doctrine?
Yes. It was actually a concept that underpinned the doctrine that the Army was focused on at the time, right? So air-land battle, the concept that drove it was this idea that we needed to be able to defeat the Warsaw Pact if they attacked Western Europe with the capabilities that we and our allies in NATO could field. And we were doing that from a position of significant relative disadvantage in terms of conventional forces. So how could we organize, train, equip ourselves, and then be prepared to fight in such a way that we could defend forward along the borders between East and West Germany at the time and the other members of the Warsaw Pact. So that was a operational concept that was devised for a very specific purpose. And we found out that because we had prepared as an Army for that for over a course of 20 years, we actually got a chance to test it out in Desert Storm, right? And it turned out to be pretty devastatingly effective, at least against the Iraqis. But we never got a chance to test it against the Warsaw Pact, thank God. So
air-land battle, let's take that as an example. It kind of affected what type of equipment the Army needed and bought and actually got to use later. So how does that doctrine flow down, and when there was a change of, and wasn't that precision strike and integrated ISR and all that stuff, didn't that change what the Army kind of did and used and affected fires and sustainment and all those things?
Yeah, so the interesting part about that, so we have narratives, right? So there's the narrative that the Big Five at the time, which was the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the multiple launch rocket system, the Apache helicopter, and the Paladin self-propelled howitzer, that those things were fielded so that we could do air-land battle. Well, okay, that's kind of true, but a lot of those programs started before we ever came up with air-land battle because of the nature of weapon systems and how long it takes to get them to the field. What really happened, and there's a book called, or a pair of books in a series called Press On by a guy named Louis Sorley. I got him on a bookshelf behind me. And it recounts the process for coming up with this air-land battle concept that could be applied to the defense of Western Europe. And it's a fascinating illustration of, listen, that the Army recognized, the Army senior leadership recognized that even before you got all this new equipment, that you might have to make this fight. And you're going to fight with the Army you have. So how can we employ the capabilities the Army already had in the right combinations and then train to those contingencies with the equipment you have as we're waiting for all this new equipment to come forward? And so it's kind of like a fascinating example. The Army went through 2 or 3 iterations of it. The first was called active defense in the 70s, and it was based on this idea that we would hold reserves at these different echelons, and when the Soviets attacked, the Warsaw Pact attacked, we would launch all these counterattacks and try to stack them up on the border. Well, it was a neat idea, but it wasn't very realistic in the sense that it didn't account for the human dimension of how human beings would actually react under those conditions, right? It also didn't account for all the math problems that would be associated when every echelon maintained reserves. What happened was you didn't have enough combat power forward to actually slow them down enough to be able to use the reserves. So you had some very smart senior leaders that actually did the work of walking the ground and visiting every battalion in Europe. And at the time, that was a lot of battalions. And then they did it with the Germans as well. And they said, okay, well, this isn't going to work. So they went back to the drawing board and brought a bunch of smart folks in and said, all right, here's the problem set. And we knew at the time exactly what was in the Warsaw Pact and what would be coming. We knew how they would fight. And they did the math drills. Okay, if they bring this many divisions in this wide of a corridor, how fast can we defeat them or destroy them? And then they went back and said, okay, well, we don't have enough ammunition, so we're going to have to reposition. We can't shoot fast enough, so we need to be able to slow them down. And it all became about this idea of, if we don't engage them deep enough throughout their second and third echelons, we will get overwhelmed no matter what we do. So that concept became this idea of the extended battlefield, and you know, the Army doesn't have the capabilities to do that by itself, so it had to talk to the Air Force. And so what's the Air Force's role? How do we do this air-ground integration? Because I have to kill enemy systems, and in this case, we were talking tanks and fighting vehicles, artillery, and so forth. I've got to kill them while they're still 50 or 60 miles away, because if they ever get close enough into what we call a close fight, that direct firefight, well, we don't have enough shooters to be able to kill them fast enough before they blow through us, and then they're behind us, and we don't have the capability. There is no second echelon in NATO in those days. So that's kind of what they were thinking. And there's folks that will say, hey, well, they had the luxury of one problem set, and that is true, but it was still a very difficult problem set. And so it required a change in culture. And then as the new systems came into being, particularly the tanks, Bradleys, and Apache helicopters, you had better tools to do that with, and you kind of took the pressure off folks that were using, equipment that was 20 or 30 years old, never designed for those purposes.
So, boy, that's really helpful in terms of historical concept. And before we go much deeper, you mentioned the word operational concepts. And what's the distinction between a doctrine that's officially published in a manual versus operational concepts developed in the field or tried out in the field?
Yeah, so we use concepts in two contexts. One is the future concept. So future concept is one that you're experimenting with, that you haven't officially adopted yet, but you've developed to solve a problem that the current concept and then the Army as an organization can't solve right now. Now, it may be a problem you have right now, or maybe a problem that you anticipate. And then you have the operational concept that's in being right now, is the one that the force understands. It's the overall theme that underlies all of the doctrine, training, organizations, material leader development, and so forth for the existing force. So we'll develop a new concept to deal with a problem that we either anticipate or we've identified that the current concept is inadequate to deal with. And then that new concept, once we adopt it, drives change across what we call the DOTMLPF, that doctrine, organization, training, leadership, organizations, material, leader development, and then policy.
Whoa, that was a big mouthful and actually quite important.
Yeah.
So again, it's .mlpf-p. And that I think is kind of worth for our students remembering. It not only involves buying a tank or a gun or a UAV, but it also means all the training and supply chain and all the other stuff, policy that kind of changes how that all fits together. Is that correct? Is that what that fancy word means? Yeah,
so that's exactly right, because Army organizations and any of the services are the same in the same way. They face the same challenge. If I field a new piece of kit or I say we're going to do something differently, all of the pieces need to be able to work together. And so just because I field a new kind of tank, say we field the Abrams tanks in the 1980s, there's a big difference in the Abrams tank and the old M60 tanks, one of which was fuel consumption. All right, so the old tanks you could fuel with 5-gallon cans, and tanks that were fit on the back of 2.5-ton trucks. You couldn't fill but one Abrams per day with those capabilities, because they have 505-gallon fuel tanks and they burn through that fuel in 8 to 10 hours.
Wow.
Okay. So one platoon of tanks attached to an infantry company burns more fuel than the entire rest of the company and the company next to it. And so what did we need to do? Well, we needed to invent new tactical fuelers, which is where the HEMTTs came from. We call them HEMTTs. They're those 8-wheel trucks you've probably seen in TVs and movies. And we still use those. And you needed a lot of them. But when you do that, then you have to, where are you going to get the drivers for all these additional fuel trucks? So someone has to make some value decisions across the Army. You can't just keep growing the Army every time you say something else. So you have to decide where you're going to take people and money from to invest in these kinds of things. And then, oh, by the way, once you have this high-speed, very quick and heavy machine to support the Abrams tank, tanks don't fight by themselves. Tanks always have to fight part of a combined arms team. So they have to how is the infantry going to keep up with them? Well, the infantry carriers couldn't keep up with them, the 113s, and they weren't well enough protected to be anywhere near those tank fights going on. So we invented the Bradley fighting vehicle, kind of copying the Soviets and their BMP, in this idea that the infantry needed to be in vehicles that were protected and could move fast enough to keep up with the tanks. So even though we were looking at a defense, our defense involved a lot of requirements for mobility and counterattack. And so then you had to make all kinds of changes there too. So you had to teach people how to use the equipment. You had to develop leaders who understood how to employ it. You needed the material solutions to go and support them, and then you needed organizations that could operate them. And so everything is this kind of a big knot. You know, you throw a pebble in the pond, and those ripples go everywhere. And it's the same whether you're talking new equipment or new doctrine.
And so that's why the acronym has 7 or 8 letters, right?
That's right. And somebody has to be thinking.
Right. So you know, we're now past airland battle into, I think, multi-domain operations. Is that now official doctrine, or working on that as the new doctrine, or where is the Army on its current and joint doctrine?
Yeah, right now we're in a transition. So our current operational concept is unified land operations, which is what the Army contributes to unified action. And so unified action is the Joint Forces operational concept. They're working on a future concept now, joint all domain operations. But it's going to be evolutionary. There'll be some new capabilities that come to bear. But all the things we do in unified land operations now, we're going to have to be able to do in multi-domain operations going forward.
And maybe for the class, give us your definition of multi-domain.
Yeah, so my best attempt at explaining multi-domain operations is I'll describe the problem we're trying to solve.
Great.
And why our current concept is inadequate for that. Our Army, since the end of the Cold War, is now largely based in the continental United States. We've got forward position forces, but far, far fewer than we had, say, in 1990 or even in 2000. So what that means is that in an era of great power competition, if the Russians or Chinese were to conduct offensive operations in their near or abroad, think of Taiwan or so establishing, say, a land bridge to Kaliningrad or something like that in northeastern Europe, we don't have forces that are positioned to deal with that right now because, again, most of them are in the continental United States. So we need an operational concept that allows the Army to be effective as part of the joint force to conduct expeditionary offensive operations against a prepared theater-wide defense that's characterized by long-range surface-to-surface fires and long-range surface-to-air fires. So they got a whole lot of artillery, more than us. They've got the most robust anti-aircraft and missile defense systems in the world, not only most modern, but also the most dense, which creates dilemmas for the joint force, right? Because for the Army, since the end of the Cold War, we haven't really had to look up in the air very much. We're used to the U.S. Air Force having air supremacy. The domains are going to be contested. The air domain is going to be contested. It hasn't been contested in our recent history. The last time an enemy aircraft attacked U.S. ground forces was in the Korean War, right? A fight against the Russians or Chinese, that's not going to be true anymore. We'll be contested in cyberspace. We're contested now, but that ability to contest us in cyberspace can be disruptive to our command and control systems. We can be contested in space. An awful lot of what the Army depends upon in terms of position, navigation, and so forth, as well as communications, is based on space capabilities. Well, those adversaries can contest those capabilities. We'll be contested in the maritime domain. We haven't been contested in the maritime domain since the Second World War. All right, and so assumptions that you make that you're always going to have control of the sea are not valid assumptions in those contexts. So that's where the term multi-domain comes from in terms of the concept. It's this awareness that ground forces can no longer depend on the joint force to solve all their problems. And in fact, sometimes the ground force may be in a position to solve some problems to enable freedom of action by the services that are primarily focused on domains other than land. So in a nutshell, that's what MDO is trying to address.
And MDO is multi-domain operations.
Multi-domain operations. So we have not adopted that as our operational concept yet. We probably will in the next, by 2028 or so. But a lot of the multi-domain operations future concept, the things that have to do with the environment that we live in and the problems we have to solve, we've already brought into doctrine. We've been bringing it into doctrine since 2017.
So this kind of raises the issue of how do we reduce the lag between new capabilities and new doctrine and operational concepts? I mean, 2028 for at least people in Silicon Valley, or at least 4 new companies between now and then.
Right.
And you see this, you live with this. Is there a way to kind of compress this, or is that just the nature of the beast?
Well, a certain element of that is the nature of the beast, because material things take time to create, manufacture, and field. We can be very flexible in terms of training. We can be very flexible in terms of doctrine. We can develop and change doctrine pretty quickly. However, when we write doctrine, we have to write doctrine for the force that we have. So you can be slightly aspirational, but you really have to address what you need to do. The problem becomes, and the tension is, okay, we understand what you have to do. We understand what problem you have to solve. The question is, can you solve it at acceptable cost, or can you solve it within the political constraints of, say, of a particular conflict? That's where the tension gets to be tough. The Army stood up Futures Command deliberately to shorten that horizon between new ideas, new equipment, and new organizations.
And is it this idea of emerging tech? I mean, drones and cyber and as access to space. Is that what's impacting these rapid changes? Is also the new geopolitical stuff, but the tech impact, has that had a major change?
Yeah, I think so. The proliferation of technology, which is really due to the technology, the cost, that cost point of getting into and being able to acquire it, has been pretty democratized, right? I mean, even in the poorest parts of the world, you'll see, I spent a year in Afghanistan. I will tell you, they didn't bother setting up a modern telephone network because they didn't need to, right? They just put in cell phones. They started from what was current at the time, and so they had pretty much the most modern stuff in terms of cell phone towers and all of that. It's a crude example, but things like UASs or UAVs, the ability to use geolocating, access to commercial satellites for imagery and maps, the ability to do reconnaissance using things that are available to anybody online. All of those things have eroded the technological superiority that we enjoyed for a very long time. So we still have quite a bit of superiority in niche areas, but most of the threats in the world have caught up. And so that means, okay, you can no longer make assumptions that you're going to be in this position of relative advantage. In fact, you've got to understand that you're going to be in positions of relative advantage. Again, particularly when you're on the long end of strategic lines of communication, and they're defending or fighting or operating in their very close near abroad, where they enjoy interior lines of communication.
So that's a really interesting problem, right? It's, if the tech and changes are coming faster than we could equip our force or train our force or even come up with new concepts, it's kind of like they've got inside of our OODA loop in terms of moving faster than we could adapt. Is that a fair observation?
Well, I think it's neutral in the sense that, like terrain or the weather or anything else, everybody's going through it at the same time. What they don't necessarily always have that we did is, and I'm talking about smaller power, but the Chinese and Russians in particular have been modernizing and then trying to professionalize their force because they see that these large conscript armies are not effective in the modern era against people like us, right? These professional militaries with modern stuff. So they've made their militaries smaller as they modernize them. And so what you have is a closer to maybe the 1930s kind of model, where everybody had combustion engines, everybody had radios, everybody had airplanes. Some people had, slightly better in one area than the other, but as a rule, everybody was kind of even from the technological standpoint, and no one side enjoyed this great technological advantage. So we've kind of moved back towards that, and that era of exceptional advantage that we've enjoyed is fast going away. So that doesn't mean we're slower than them. We're probably adapting every bit as quick as they are.
All right. It's interesting you're using that analogy. One side went through France in 2 weeks.
Right.
With 5 Panzer divisions being outnumbered by the French tanks, and with a better operational concept, right?
No, that's exactly right. And it's a human dimension of what we do that comes into play. That the rest of that .mil PF is important. The doctrine is very important, but that culture that comes from how you develop leaders and how you train your organizations is hugely important. If you don't have that, you could have the greatest doctrine in the world, and it's not going to work if the people can't execute.
So let me go back to something you said in your intro, which is just kind of intriguing to me, is that you sit in the middle, it sounds like, of getting input from 30 different parts of the Army, all which you said developing their own doctrine, and you're part of a joint doctrine, which I want to remind my students, is the services now, in theory, work jointly. The Army is, if it doesn't have control of the air, is pretty exposed, and controlling the air without controlling the ground. So you feed a joint doctrine. Is that correct? Is that the right model to think about where you sit?
Yes, it very much is. So what we focus on here, because there is a certain top-down aspect to this within each of the services. So we're responsible for what we call a capstone operational doctrine, or FM Field Manual 3.0 operations. That's the capstone operations doctrine for the U.S. Army. All the other doctrines got to be congruent with that. So we figure out how we need to fight in this one particular publication, and that informs changes across the hierarchy of publications within the Army. And then within the Army, or within the Joint Force rather, anything having to do with operations on land, the Army has lead. So we work with the Marine Corps because they obviously fight on land as well. But we're the subject matter experts on that. So we inform a lot of doctrine for the other services where there's overlap and interest, particularly things that have to do with air-ground integration, transportation, and those things that the Army does for the other services or the other services do for the Army.
And let me go back, is when the 30 Army groups are handing you their doctrine, are they tied to weapons you have or things you want, or are they aspirational, or do they have to match that whole DTA MLPF part? I mean, are they, this is what we're going to have, or this is what we do have?
They write to what we do have, and they work and iterate drafts of things that we may not have yet, but we're fielding right now. So I'll give you an example. It's Multi-Domain Task Force. You can Google it. There's all kinds of discussions online about this. It's a new formation. And we're trying to write doctrine as they're standing this unit up. They did a few experiments with a pilot a couple years ago. But that's going to be very draft for a while until they get a chance to put that new unit, that new formation through the paces in exercises and experiments and so forth. Most of the time, it's really not that difficult because most of what we address tends to evolve over time. So accounting for some new things here and there, it isn't particularly difficult. What the challenge is, it can often be, though, when your operational environment has changed. In other words, the world has changed around you. The Army, through its doctrine and how it adapts its leader development, its training, its organizations, has got to adapt to that world as well. It's not the world that you want it to be, it's the world as it is. And so that's what we spend a lot of time.
The counterinsurgency manual being the good example. That
would be a very good example. Yes.
We ended up in a world that we didn't expect, and we looked around and we didn't have a manual, right? Or the last manual we had was 40 years before in Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, okay, we're going to go through this big intellectual effort. We're going to make sure we get the best practices. We bring in a bunch of subject matter experts from all of the Army and academia in this case, or in that case, to take a look at this. And then we have smart people red team it. And then you put it to the forces in the field, and they're going to give you some feedback on it, and then you've got to adapt it some more.
Got it. So I have a last question here, which you just made me think about, which is relevant for this class. Do you think new tech like AI, autonomy, drones are going to force an immediate change in doctrine like the counterinsurgency manual, or will we have time to 2028 to leisurely roll out the MDA?
Yeah, my opinion is a lot of the things that people talk about in terms of, say, we'll use drones, for example. Drones have been around a lot. The good news was we were the ones that had all the drones and the other guys didn't have them. So we were pretty familiar with drones. After we saw what the Russians did to the Ukrainians in the Donbass in 2014, using drones to destroy the better part of what we would call an armored brigade combat team in 20 minutes, from the time they saw it to the time they had long-range artillery coming in on them, that was a big wake-up call for us. And so over the last 6 years or so, we've been looking, not just from a doctrinal standpoint, because shooting stuff down, we have doctrine for that, but really, what do we have in the Army that can combat those things to keep them, from flying over our heads? And at the time, we didn't have anything, unless you wanted to shoot what is it, a $15 million Patriot at a $300 drone, right? You're not going to win that economic exchange in the long run. So we needed to look at some other things, and we've started now to field some capabilities, some counter UAV or counter drone capabilities. That's an example where the material stuff, those solutions, that's the long pole in the tent. It's figuring out, okay, what's going to work at scale to do that, because that's the other challenge with the Army. It's scale, right? We're the largest professional Army in the world, and so we don't just do things in little bits. When we try to solve a problem, we got to be able to scale up that solution big enough so that it matters. It may be neat that I have this very niche, high-speed, exotic piece of equipment that can shoot down a couple drones with laser beams, but if I don't have, I'll pick a number, 3,000 of those things that I can employ over the depth and breadth of an area of operations, and I don't have enough to solve my problem. And so that's one thing. Yeah, people have trouble sometimes forgetting that, we have to do things at scale.
A great example. And probably a great way to kind of end up here. Are there things we should have asked you think our students should know about technology and innovation and doctrine and concepts and operation?
Well, I guess the one thing I would talk about is when we talk about new technology, when we talk about doctrine, we always have to relate things back to people, okay? So there's this human dimension of the operations we conduct. So armies and all the services, but land forces in particular, we live in this, we don't call it a domain, we call it a human dimension, but land is where people live. Land is where decisions get made. And land is messy, because anywhere there's people, it's messy. Conflict is messy. And there was a temptation at the turn of this past century, 20 years ago, to think of warfare in terms of targeting and technology, and that if we just blow up the right thing or kill the right person at the right time and place, the other guys are going to give up. And our experience, as everybody knows, is that is not the case. And so there's a human dimension in terms of our leaders. You can talk at the political level, you can talk at the strategic level, you can talk at the various military levels. And so our concepts and our doctrine, as well as the systems we feel, have got to account for that human dimension of things. There's going to be some game changers, there's no doubt. I'm sure AI will be an example of that. But we have some limited types of AI now. You know, you see it in the Aegis cruisers and some of these other very expensive platforms. But doctrine and concepts have got to be able to be executed by real people under real conditions. And they need to be applicable to the places that you're most likely going to have to operate. I guess the last thing I would throw out there for you too is...
full stop. I think that was
Okay.
No. We'll keep going. But I mean, that was a great piece of insight here, is that, you know, doctrine has to be implemented by people.
Right.
And it's not just tech. There has to be people trained and motivated, and that is the Army we fight with, are motivated professionals, not just autonomous. Keep going. I'm sorry, but I thought it was a great insight.
No, that's absolutely right. Here's the other thing with tech too. Any sort of tech's got to be able to be adapted to these very brutal conditions under which conflicts tend to take place. There are plenty of times, no matter how good the tech is, and I say this as an armor officer, you know, being on tanks my whole life, there's times where the tech just doesn't work. And it may not work because the bad guys are doing something. It may not work because of the weather. But there's all kinds of times where being overly dependent on tech can get you into a bad way. And so what do you require? Well, you require people to be able to use what does work in the right combinations to solve that problem at hand. And they got to be able to adapt to it very quickly. And so doctrine has to account for that. Your operational concepts should account for that. And the way you train and organize your formations need to account for that. So there's a lot of people who are efficiency experts, right? The Lean Six Sigma guys, right, are out there in the world. They're always looking for efficiencies, and they say, well, we've got these redundancies between the services. You've got redundancies. But listen, if you don't have those redundancies, you can find yourself in a bad way, because you're not creating dilemmas for your adversaries. The redundancies, in other words, the different services, some of them doing the same kinds of things, they actually create redundancies for the bad guys. They no longer have the luxury to prepare for only one bag of tricks, right? They got to deal with all of our bags of tricks. And we have to kind of approach warfighting that way as well. And so that's what we try to do.
I think this was incredibly helpful for our students. And
okay.
Rich, I got smarter, and I know they're going to be smarter as well. So let me thank you for this time. I think this is probably one of the best conversations I've had on the role of doctrine and how it fits in the Army, and more importantly, how it fits in jointness, and how technology just doesn't magically appear in the hands of every soldier when it shows up in somebody's lab.